Coming to you now, it's Long Waves Radio with Gary Krug. Stay with me. And I'm going to tell you at the top of the show here that the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and not necessarily those of the staff, management, or underwriters of KYRS. And thank you for joining me today. It's a beautiful day here in Spokane and a thoughtful day for me. I've decided to do a slightly different show. I'm going to focus today a little less on contemporary news, current news, and a little more on some deeper issues. And today I'm going to be borrowing a lot of ideas and a few quotes from a book by a Canadian author, who, if you don't know, you should. His name is John Ralston Saul, S-A-U-L, and the book is The Unconscious Civilization, which is published by the Free Press, and their first edition of this was 1997. But let me move along and introduce what I want to talk about here today. It amazes me that people don't participate in voting. People don't participate in voting. Particularly in Washington, it amazes me where we make it so easy for people to vote. I mean, it is so stupidly easy to vote in Washington. And people don't do it. I don't get it. If you look at the national figures in the 2014 midterm elections, 36.4% of people nationally voted, which means that 63.6% did not. In Washington State, in that same midterm, the overall percentage was a little over 54%, 54.16 overall in Washington. And Spokane County actually did a little better at 56.54% who participated. But that still meant that almost half of the people in Spokane County did not participate in voting. Why is this important? Because just like jury duty, which again is something most people try to get out of as quick as they can, voting is a chance to participate in government in some very real ways. And we don't have a lot of those, right? There aren't a lot of ways that are just given to us to participate. So jury duty and voting, this is pretty much it. But these are important. These are important because jury service allows you to participate in the administration of law, and is sometimes the only place where justice can be served, because juries can always say, no, we think justice here is more important than the law. Judges will tell you you're not supposed to do that. But it happens all the time, and there are a lot of cases in precedents when this has happened. So jury service is an important place to serve, but because people don't, we end up with juries that so often aren't representative of the community. We end up with juries of people who have time they can take off, who don't have kids they've got to care for, who actually care enough to want to go down and do this and show up, and aren't too concerned if they get yet another warrant. But why would people abdicate the only real forms of power in relationship to their government that they have? Right? Voting is the great power to exert some influence and even a good degree of control on the legislature, but it only works if it's exercised. The U.S. Census Department did a voting survey in 2008, which was interesting. And they are asking people the reasons why they don't vote, which is also interesting. Why don't people vote? And the most common reason given, the most common reason given for why people don't vote was illness or disability, about 15%. Right? And conflicting schedules roughly in the same area, about 17%. So that's about a third of the registered non-voters, one-third of them, which is, a number, but it's not all of them. It's not a lot, about a third. Of the remaining voters, about 13% expressed lack of interest. Just can't be bothered to do this, right? Just can't be bothered to participate in voting. And this is odd and peculiar. Very odd and very peculiar. About another 13% said there was they disliked the candidates or the issues. Disliked the candidates or the issues. Now think about that for a minute. That's just nuts, isn't it? Oh, I don't like what the issues are they're talking about. Well, if you don't vote, you're not going to get a chance to talk about issues, are you? Of any kind. It's just not going to happen. You're going to be frozen right out by your own lack of participation. And that can't be a good thing. That can't be a good thing at all. So, yet people will do this. People will refuse to get off of their butts and go off and vote. So about a third of the registered voters vote because they have conflicting schedules, don't vote because they have conflicting schedules, or they have illness or disability, and that's especially true among older voters. But more than a quarter of registered voters didn't vote because they weren't interested or didn't like the choices. Seriously? Oh, dear. And we have this idea that voting, is not important. But if voting's not important, why would so many states go to such extreme measures to eliminate voters from the rolls through a variety of techniques, including cleaning the rolls, as they like to put it, where they go through and they search for duplicate names or people are no longer at this address and just remove them from the voting rolls. And very, very often, they remove registered voters who are actually eligible. But it's a nice way, especially if you do it by neighborhoods, to cull voters who aren't going to vote, well, generally Republican. This tends to happen in places like Florida. Florida is bad for this. Texas has done it. But they'll clean people off the rolls. They'll do a variety of things to prevent people from voting once they get there. They'll require ID cards, state ID cards, and they specifically will exclude student ID cards, which are granted by an agency of the state, because they know students tend to vote progressive. They tend to vote Democrat or Green or, dare I think, socialist, and not Republican. So let's try and suppress student votes. And there are other tricks that we've all heard about too, where the powers that be will put 2 voting booths in a district with 10,000 people, in a precinct with 10,000 people. So you'll have lines around the block and down the next street where people are standing out there for 4, 5, 6 hours, if they can vote at all, if they can actually get in there before the polls close. So we see these kinds of shenanigans. And why would anyone do these kinds of shenanigans unless voting were important? Why would people try to exclude folks from changing the power structure if it didn't matter who was in power? And to say, well, it doesn't matter to me, well, that's something else that I want to talk about today. Why don't we have a sense of voting? And there's some related issues that I'm going to talk about as well. The lack of participation generally in social and communal and community activities. The lack of a sense of responsibility for actions in the community, especially for considering the community as a whole when one makes decisions. And all too often, way too many people fall back on this bizarre idea of individualism, which I'm going to be unpacking today. As a large part of this collapse of the public and of participation of people in fulfilling their obligations, a large part of this is not accidental. This lack of interest and this dislike of candidates or of the issues is cultivated. It's cultivated on Fox News. It's cultivated in a sort of pervasive cynicism that we see in news and in discussion of issues. And on one level, people get a sort of vague sense they're being lied to, or at least not told the whole truth or misled. But there are techniques that are used that are much more subtle than that and much larger than that. This lack of interest or dislike of candidates follows from establishing a sense of individualism that is separate from society. It is, in a sense, a new tribalism. And they often talk about my family values. And they mean their family values. They don't mean other people's family values. My family values. I got mine. And I don't want you bringing your family values in here, because I got my family values. We hear things from the lunatics like, we don't want our government to do anything for us, Ted Nugent, big round of applause. And we hear other kinds of Tea Party extremist rants about individualism. Don't tread on me, But if one doesn't participate in governance, and if one doesn't have a sense of the commonwealth and the common good, and indeed the commons, what is he? What is she? Now let's think about this for a minute. There are basically three positions in society that one can occupy in relationship to your government. All right? Basically three. And the highest of these, the one with the most power, the most privilege, the most rights, the most say, is the position of citizen. Because citizens have rights guaranteed by law and defended mainly in the fact that citizens exercise their rights. Because when people do not exercise their rights tend to get taken away or usurped by other people. Citizens have a large amount of control on their government. They have the opportunity to express their will and to formulate common consensus and common understandings through argument and discussion and debate, and then enacting this through voting and through other forms of participation. There's a common good that has to be attended. In fact, in Athens, in the 5th century BCE, in Athens, the wealthy were required to do acts of public good, to spend money on public projects. It was expected of them, and they may have grumbled a little bit, but they did it because they were citizens, and they owed that. So from citizen, we move down one step. The next level down in the position of people in relationship to government would be subjects. Subjects think feudalism, think serfs. Subjects have few real rights, except as they're granted by power, and on very rare occasions they are sometimes wrested from power, pulled away from power. We could think of the English nobles forcing the Magna Carta into existence, but it was a weak king and powerful nobles, and they were able to pull that off. Generally, the rights are granted, and generally by a sovereign, by a ruler, as opposed to a leader. Now, I remember during the George W. Bush administration, more than a few times, hearing people, especially kind of low-level politicrats, referring to Bush as a leader, as a ruler, and talking about what a strong ruler he was. And I was amazed at this language, because rulers don't have citizens, they have subjects. I was amazed that people celebrated this and used the term. And maybe Adorno was right. Maybe 25% of any population in the West is in favor of some kind of fascist control, or at least an authoritarian control, where daddy's always right and daddy tells you what to do and daddy passes you the laws. Maybe Adorno was right and Horkheimer that there is 25% of that population. But there's 75% who aren't that, and that's the overwhelming majority. The thing about being a subject is your rights can be rescinded at any time. And the current serfs, the current subjects, are worse off than the serfs in the Middle Ages in some very real ways, because serfs and indeed the craft guilds of the period still had some reciprocal relationships with power. Power still owed them some things based on decency, based on church law, based on history. It was called noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobility. And it was also hugely supported by the Roman Catholic Church. So even serfs in the Middle Ages had perhaps a little more protection than serfs in the modern age. It's debatable, but it's worth thinking about. So let's move down to the next step. The next step down, we find slaves. Slaves have no rights. Slaves don't vote. Slaves aren't allowed to participate. Slaves aren't allowed to go some places. Slaves aren't allowed to have some things. They are property. They own nothing, not even their labor. They do not even own their own lives. They have no participation. And I have to confess, I have never seen such a headlong retreat from citizenship into slavery conducted with such unconscious willingness and such glad participation as I see in the United States over the last 10 years. A headlong retreat from citizenship into slavery. This is a neat trick. This is a very neat trick. The people who pulled this off did a very good job of it. So let's consider how this worked. We have this series of ideologies which are expressed as politics. A lot of politics in the U.S. these days is just ideology. And you can tell by the language there's nothing real being discussed. It's gibberish. You can have people grandstanding and doing shows and saying long chunks of things that sound like words but don't mean anything. It's not really language, and it's certainly not communication. I remember Grover Norquist in his famous statement that he didn't want to destroy government. He just wanted to shrink it down to the size it could be drowned in a bathtub. So think about this. So if we could shrink government down until it's virtually nothing, have virtually no government, what then? What is the good that's supposed to come of this? Well, the suggestion from the Grover Norquists of the world is that with government removed, persons, would finally be free to enjoy the fruits of their labors and to pursue their own ends. Problem is, nature hates a vacuum, and if one structure of power is removed, another will surely take its place. If you remove government, another power will move in to take its place. And what would that power be? Right? We're not going to return to some Garden of Eden with absolute freedoms if government's removed or dismantled. We're not going to be sitting around, picking the fruit off the trees and just living our happy-go-lucky lives. Not a bit of it. The garden we shall inherit won't be ruled by a benign God. It'll be ruled by a corporate state. It won't be ruled by government of and by and for the people. It'll be a government of, by, and for the corporate entities who will move into that vacuum, who already are moving into that vacuum, because citizens are racing headlong to become slaves. We heard Mitt Romney tell us, corporations are people, my friends. Corporations are people. They are people, but they're not human. They do not die. They cannot be punished. They don't feel pain. They have no body to incarcerate. And they have no morals other than to maximize shareholder profits, though these are sometimes sacrificed to some extent for the manager's profits. Think of Enron. Think of Citicorp and all these people. But corporations, as people, as persons, pursue their own ends, and this is modeled as individual freedom for the garden variety human person. Right? This pursuing of one's own ends to the disregard of everything else. And the individualism that's peddled to us is modeled on this same idea that corporations have. It's a false notion of individualism as a personal matter that has no obligation to the social. We seek our own ends and desires without a concern for how our means to those ends might hurt, cheat, deprive others of their ends and desires. It is truly Hobbes's state of nature. It is true. The corporate world is truly the world of fang and claw and survival of the fittest. Truly. John Ralston Saul writes, "The promise, real or illusionary, of personal self-fulfillment leaves no room for the individual as a responsible and conscious citizen." And this conscious citizen is important because we are an unconscious people, hugely. And this unconsciousness arises in part because we don't have a language of the public. And this was a problem noted by John Dewey back in 1925 in his book, The Public and Its Problems. Dewey's view of the problem was rather similar to Saul's. A little different, but similar. Dewey said, "Our Babel is not of tongues, but of the lack of shared signs and symbols without which public life is impossible." Shared signs and symbols, a language that communicates. Dewey said, it's not that there's no public, there are too many publics. They can't find themselves. They can't organize themselves. Because you can't do that without a meaningful language of politics, a meaningful language of the public that includes ideas like the common good, which corporations do not share, except in very narrow senses. It's important to note that the words and the pronouncements and the advertisements and PR releases and all this stuff that corporations and increasingly government produce and release are largely without meaning. They do not communicate. They are not language. Rather, they're techniques of persuasion, which we can't use. Right? You and I can't put ads on the Super Bowl to communicate with our government. You and I don't have the money, don't have the expertise, don't have a whole bunch of stuff. Can't afford to hire advertising firms to represent us. And it wouldn't matter anyway. So where is our public? Where is this shared language of free people reflecting on their lives in the context of a social world, discussing their lives and their common needs and hopes and fears with others in a shared social world? The default position for a lot of folks is to stock up their basements with ammunition and MREs and wait out the end times. You can't have a politics built on that. You can't have a social built on that. You cannot have a government built on that. Saul suggests that what we have are these ideas, these ideologies, these fantasies of manufactured utopias presented to us through the non-communication of corporate language, the manipulative language of advertising, and the coercive and deceptive language of politics. Now, this was really well captured. This whole sense was really well captured by a poem written by a woman named Kendra Esch called This is a Generic Advertisement. And later it was turned into a YouTube video using only stock footage that the advertising company had lying around. And they put her poem to music. But this is a generic advertisement. And I will play you the video version now. Sorry for the loud beep. There was a word they can't use on the air here. So, Kendra Esch.
We think first of vague words that are synonyms for progress and pair them with footage of a high-speed train. Science is doing lots of stuff that may or may not have anything to do with us. See how this guy in a lab coat holds up a beaker? That means we do research. Here's a picture of DNA. There are a load of people in the world, especially in India. See how we're part of the global economy? Look at those farmers in China. But we also do business in the USA, or want you to think we do. Check out this wind energy thing in Indiana, and this blue-collar guy with dirt on his face. Also, we care about the environment, loosely. Here's some powerful rushing water and people planting trees. Our policies could be related to these panoramic views of Costa Rica. In today's high-speed environment, stop-motion footage of a city at night with cars turning quickly makes you think about doing things efficiently and time passing. Lest you think we're a faceless entity, look at all these attractive people. Here's some of them talking and laughing, and close-ups of hands passing canned goods to each other in a setting that evokes community service. Equality, innovation, honesty, and advancement are all words we choose from a list. Our prophets are awe-inspiring, like this guy who's looking up and pointing at a skyscraper or a kite while smiling and explaining something to his child. Using a specific ratio of Asian people to black people to women to white men, we want to make sure we represent your needs and interests, or at least a version of your skin color in our ads. Did we put a baby in here? What about an ethnic old man whose wrinkled smile represents the happiness and wisdom of the poor? Yep.
So, that was a rendering of Kendra Esch's poem. This is a generic advertisement. You really should see the video on YouTube. It's something to see with the pictures all in place. But it captures beautifully the idea that there are images and sounds and words that capture our attention, that move us, that engage us, that mean nothing. That mean nothing. But they fill us with a sense of, oh, a corporation is such a good corporation. They're such good people, blah, blah, blah. They're not addressed to rational or reflective persons. You're not supposed to think about this. You're just supposed to get it in one. It's like Roland Barthes' mythologies. It's all form. There's no content. Likewise, the utterances of politics, increasingly, are not addressed to rational, reflective persons, and certainly not people with a sense of history or a grasp of complexities in the world, because when they are, these people tend to laugh out loud. They're not designed to be considered or examined or analyzed. They're statements of pure ideology. They're meant to possess the mind and the heart. They're meant to be swallowed whole without chewing, and ideally without choking. Politicians don't speak of issues, but of the interests of those who've paid for them. That's what they act on. When they speak to us, it sounds like a generic ad. And you listen to Cathy McMorris Rodgers talk. it sounds like a generic ad. And yet it still works for the folks back home because they're not thinking, they're not analyzing, they don't have a sense of history. And this is useful to power. John Saul quotes Mussolini, who said, "The crowd doesn't have to know, it must believe. If only we can give them faith that mountains can be moved, they will accept the illusion that mountains are movable, and thus an illusion may become a reality." Mussolini. And in the words and images of films and music, we're taught to believe the lies that sustain power. We're taught to believe the lies that construct enemies out of other people. We're taught to believe the lies that individual freedom, corporate or human, is the only good, and they're lies. But this is our ethos. This is our world. And because it is, our leaders turn against education. The corporate sector turns against education and thought. And this belief, too, is transmitted to the great unwashed through all kinds of interesting ideological devices, so that many of those most directly concerned with individual freedom and personal liberty attack the teaching of controversial subjects in school. They attack books that challenge beliefs as being satanic. Or they simply withdraw from public education completely and homeschool, so-called. It's no accident that the Christian right set its sights on the school boards back in the 80s as the first step to advancing this ideology, to getting control of power. If you can control what children are taught, you control what children grow up to know and believe. And they were very successful at this in a number of states, especially in the South. Power thrives where people are marginally illiterate, where they have no historical knowledge worth the name, and they've, most importantly, never learned to critically engage an idea that seems alien or threatening to them. Global warming, what's that? It sounds like communism. Is that more of that Muslim stuff? They've never learned to critically engage. Thus, in higher education as well, we see a turn away from funding the liberal arts. The liberal arts are dying on the vine. Nobody wants to major in English. What do you do with an English degree? What did you ever do with an English degree? I'll get to that in a minute. But the whole turn in funding is toward training STEM and computer people and technical stuff. Not the liberal arts. The liberal arts, those places where one would acquire slowly and deliberately the training and the knowledge and the examination of texts of importance and meaning, and would learn the things that are necessary and fitting for a free person to examine the world, put it in context, and have one's own ideas about it. But for us, it's, all we want now, we want to get jobs out of the educational system. Let's put the money into STEM, science, technology, engineering, right? All this stuff, medicine. That's what we need. High tech. Don't nobody need to read no books. Ain't making me no money. And the logic of this whole move, if you think I'm being crazy, the logic is revealed simply by considering this. Most persons in the U.S. cannot attend college without incurring a substantial amount of debt. And this debt cannot be expunged by bankruptcy, can't be negotiated down usually, but it will consume a large percentage of their income for a decade or more after graduation, if in fact they're lucky enough to get a job. So just to get a degree now, one has to go into tens of thousands of dollars of debt. So are you not going to choose something that's going to get me a job, maybe? Give me a prospect of a job that might pay well enough to pay off this debt? And meanwhile, who wants to study English? who wants to study philosophy. Why? People who are interested in the mind, people who are interested in ideas, people who are interested in knowledge. They study philosophy. They study history. They study English. And this mindset of let's monetize education and let's focus on jobs and technology has a follow-on effect in the system, which benefits banks and lenders, as well as the contemporary education business. And it damages the consumer economy. It damages the housing industry. It damages other financial aspects of the country, for they who have no money cannot buy. And if their money's all tied up, or big chunks of it are tied up servicing loans, they can't buy houses. They can't buy cars. So what do we see? We see stacks of apartments being built, and we see very few young people buying houses. So we've bought the idea. The trap is that we've bought the idea and these false dreams sold by corporatism of this. Somehow corporatism is going to produce this idyllic small town. If we can just get government off the back of business, we'll be able to go back to this idyllic kind of view of the 50s or 60s or something like this. Now, I remember Pat Buchanan. I've probably mentioned this on the show before. Pat Buchanan once famously said that he remembered a time in America when we all read the same books and listened to the same music and saw the same films. No, we didn't. That never happened. It's a myth. And nothing's more mythic than nostalgia. Yet the rhetoric is of return to small towns, tribal values, family values, and again, no obligation to the social whole. So, why not have a war on immigrants? Why not try to deprive people of rights, LGBT people in particular? Why not try to have wars just over difference that you don't even understand? Why not? Because I'm back in my village, and it's my world, and I live here. It's mine. You leave me alone now. But it's in precisely this kind of rhetoric that the corporations are freed. It's precisely this kind of ideation that frees global capital, that frees Citicorp and Deutsche Bank to do whatever they want, to thrive as corporations to the expense of everything else. Our civil liberties become theirs. They become citizens. We become slaves. And this is sold to us, as I say again, these disingenuous packages which have no proof that the stuff they're promising us is ever going to happen. Remember the promises around NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement? How it was going to bring jobs to the U.S. and strengthen manufacturing. What happened when it was passed? They took a lot of the factories, a lot of the manufacturing, and shipped them down to where they could exploit other people and exploit other people's land and other people's water and workers in other areas. And people in America lost good paying jobs. It was a lie. It was a lie. But it is also the holy mantra of all presidents in recent times to have to speak of free markets and free speech as if they're somehow connected. And they do, in so many words. And they usually put free markets first. Reagan and George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George Bush, Obama, all of them. It is a declaration of faith in this ruinous ideology required of all leaders. Free markets. Free markets always first. And free markets lead to free speech and free people. No, they don't. They don't. Or rather they do, but only if the persons you're talking about are corporations, not natural persons. Saul points out that the end of all this is this modern Garden of Eden, innocent, simple, unconscious. And he's right. The garden is uniformity, naivety, an absence of critical thought, philosophy, analysis, and finally an abdication of responsibility for anything except one's self. And that includes an abdication of responsibility for the good of others. But here come the corporate and technocratic speech acts. I can't even say language or communication, speech acts. These corporate and technocratic speech acts and ideologies presenting themselves as inexorable and universal truth incarnate. It's like Jesus is descended from Citibank to bring us the word, the free market, the equilibrium of human desires in society. If everyone is free to pursue his or her own selfish interest, it all achieves equilibrium. Well, it doesn't. It's a flawed model. It was flawed from its design. But it's still touted as if it makes sense. And no one can point to an example of where it actually works, but it doesn't matter. It's not about truth. It's about ideology. It's not about actually telling us something we should know. It's about convincing us that something is true, that mountains are movable. We see this as well, reflected in the technocratic form in government. It shows up in various forms of censorship and control, both formal and informal. And it shows up in surveillance. So let's talk about surveillance for a minute. This country is surveillance mad. The one great thing, the one great change that 9/11 brought to this country was to unleash a cancer of surveillance through the country, through the world. We have the NSA data center they're building down just out of Salt Lake City in Utah. We have this push for global spectrum dominance. We have the Five Eyes system. It used to be called Echelon, which is scoop up every communication in the world and throw it into databanks. Every click, every phone call, every text, every Grindr message, whatever. And then, once upon a time, we had this idea of TIA, Total Information Awareness. And this was proposed early on in Bush's administration by John Ashcroft, among others. He was the Attorney General. This is the man who once lost an election to a dead man. That's how popular he was in Missouri. But Ashcroft had this curious idea of turning citizens into spies, where he was going to recruit 24 million Americans to spy on their neighbors, the milkman, the arborist, the gardeners, whatever. Spy and report anything that seemed odd. You know what this sounds like to me? It sounds to me like the Stasi. It sounds to me like the East German secret police and their networks of informers that they developed after World War II. And we have a modern version of it, which has just emerged kind of innocuously. See something, say something. Something doesn't look right to you, better report it to the authorities. And what could that be? Oh, gee, it might be a man in a turban, not even a turban, but a man wearing a traditional headdress walking down a suburban street in a nice neighborhood in rural Alabama, and the woman calls up and says he's looking in garages and he's wearing, and I quote, a toboggan, and he looks really suspicious. So the cops came and throw him to the ground and paralyze him, break his spine. An old man who's visiting his grandson who owns a house on that street. I saw something. I said something. And the old guy got his back broken. There's a lesson in this for all of us. You know, people do raise critiques. We do have some people trying to get out there and breathe life into something like a public sphere. We got rallies, you know. You can turn out 40 or 50 people in Spokane for a rally or for a march. You can go around and pat yourself on the back and feel good. Give speeches. You can write articles, publish them in papers. I can do radio shows. I'm trying to. But like the people organizing rallies, like the people, publishing their articles in the Inlander, well-meaning though they are, it's just so much babble. As Saul notes, language must relate in some practical way to the structures of power. A practical way, a practical relationship of language to the structures of power, or it is just so much babble. The protests are babble. Let them protest as long as they pay their taxes. We already see corporations moving into the vacuum of power left by citizens deserting their duties. We already see it. And everybody knows the deal's rotten. Old Black Joe's still picking cotton for your ribbons and bows, as Leonard Cohen wrote. Corporations have enormous influence on government. We see it. We see it all the time. We see Boeing, for example, one of the most influential companies in the world, one of the biggest aircraft companies in the world, if not the biggest. They spent $12 million lobbying in 9 months of last year. $12 million, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. And Boeing has its own political action committee, which donated another $2.2 million to federal candidates during 2010. 53% of which went to Democrats. And as of last year, I believe this is last year, Boeing's PAC had donated $748,000 to federal politicians. The convicted lobbyist, Jack Abramoff, y'all remember him, over the Indian casino scandal, spent a little time in Club Fed, said access is vital in lobbying. If you can't get in the door, you can't make your case. Here we had a hostile senator whose staff was hostile, and we had to get in. So that's the lobbyist safecracker method. Throw fundraisers, raise money, become a big donor. Do you know lobbyists outnumber legislators in Washington in the healthcare industry alone by 6-1? 6 lobbyists from the healthcare industry for each legislator. If you take lobbyists overall, senators, representatives, lobbyists overall outnumber senators and representatives 23.9 to 1. There are over 13,000 registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and probably more who are unregulated. Probably. So we see this enormous corporate influence. They have much more money than we do. They get to call up senators and congressmen and women on the phones. They have their private numbers. They get to walk right in. They get to have fundraisers for them, sit around and drink drinks with them. And they get to also arrange cushy landings for them in corporate-sponsored think tanks. Or when a legislator leaves office, he or she can simply become a lobbyist. Washington Post, 2011, said that over a 10-year period, 5,400 congressional staff, former congressional staff, had become lobbyists, and some 400 congresspeople had become lobbyists. It's 40 congresspeople a year and 540 staffers becoming lobbyists. You talk about inside trading. Contacts. I know everybody. We're good friends. Let me have a word with him. All right? And then we have this revolving door of lobbyists. So we had Obama's, almost his entire finance and treasury department was filled with people from former mega banks. And these are the people writing legislation. Like they're going to hurt their former people. And when their jobs are done there, they're going right back to their jobs in banking. There have been people who get hired onto the EPA solely to write regulations on the oil companies, and they're oil company employees, or they were, they've resigned, and they stay on for 3 or 6 months. They write the legislation, get it passed, and they go back to being oil people and get their big salaries, and bonuses too, I'm sure. And bonuses too, I'm sure. And if you have any doubt about the how pervasive the power of corporations is, you should look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and this should scare every person who cares at all for democracy. It's being negotiated right now, and it's such a hideous, if you don't know what it is, it's a multilateral trade agreement with, I believe it's 16 countries in Asia and the U.S., and it's so hideous and weird that they're having to negotiate it in secret. They've released little tidbits, but WikiLeaks released the whole darn draft. And you can go to WikiLeaks and find it if you can wade through the rhetoric of this thing. It's really spooky. It's really spooky. This is a treaty being negotiated to benefit corporations while weakening government, effectively destroying government's abilities to regulate corporations, as long as they're multinational and between signatories of this document. So, for instance, if a corporation says they didn't make as much money as they expected to make in a particular country because it has some tacky environmental regulations, or maybe it demands that its workers be paid too much money, the corporations solve this by getting their tribunal to rule, and it would have the power to override local, county, state, and national laws among the signatories. So there you go. That would be a corporate coup complete. Done. And what are they working on? They're working on drugs. Big Pharma is a huge part of this. Phone technologies are a huge part of it. Copyright's big. I mean, think about this. Tobacco industry actually wants in this treaty to be able to limit non-smoking campaigns and other actions that might reduce people smoking. And they would have that right. And they could override any legislation at any level in any signatory country. They'd call it a trade barrier. You're trying to keep people from getting addicted to a substance that kills them, marketed by a heartless agency, and that's a trade barrier. It's hard to even know where to go from that. But, yeah, I'll just leave that. Anyway, let me see if I can wrap up this show. So corporations grow and profit, and they take over increasingly larger segments of the government. They get increasing power to not just control the way bills and laws are made or removed, but being able to actively override existing laws in the name of profit. Laws passed to protect people, to protect water, air, land, freedoms, labor rights. That's the vision of the individual that pervades the world today. Not the one the Tea Party thinks. But the Tea Party, and a lot of people who aren't Tea Party, will confuse their idea of individual liberties with some fantasy. But the corporations have another idea in mind altogether. Why are students in college having to take out multi-$1,000 loans? There's no shortage of money for education. The crisis of education is properly a crisis of priorities. Profits for corporations or for people? Profits for corporations or schools? Corporations or universities? Corporations or infrastructure? Corporations or public health? The money's there, but the will to ensure that a proportion of it, which would only be decent, the will to ensure that a proportion of it that would only be decent cannot be apportioned to the Commonwealth, to the common good. No more taxes. No, I don't want any more taxes. It's a rallying cry. But it's the rallying cry of the corporations. And this is inculcated into this uncritical populace as the defense of their petty holdings. Their house, their car, their gun collection, their TV. So, this is why the public does not act through their one power of voting. And not acting is, they think it's self-defense, they think it's self-preservation, but it's quite the opposite. It is a thoroughgoing abdication of everything that could be meaningfully called freedom or individual rights. Because the only place individual rights make any sense at all is when there's a sense of a shared good. And a big part of your individual freedom is directed to that, as is a big part of the individual freedom of others. And thus, we build a democracy and a community. That concludes today's show. Thank you so much for listening. You've been listening to Long Waves Radio with Gary Krug. And you can reach me by writing longwaves at kyrs.org. You can find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio. And as always, we are live cast, and you can find podcasts on YouTube. Just search with Long Waves Radio in quotations. Be sure the quotes are there. You'll turn up a bunch of stuff on electronics. Long Waves Radio in quotes. Podcasts are there. If you have ideas for shows, comments, critiques, if you like this show, if you hate this show, I'd love to hear from you. So please avail yourselves of that opportunity. And I will tell you right here at the end of the show, you're listening to KYRS Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial. Thank you again for listening. Until next week, I'm out of here.